It's always sunny in Philadelphia. The Eagles are Super Bowl champions. We'll talk some NFL, the Combine, the Draft, and much, much more here on 97.3 ESPN with John McMullen. Of course, you can hear him every day at this time on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Johnny Mac, what's happening, pal?
What's happening, guys?
All is well.
Saquon Barkley Day.
We'll get into him in a minute because definitely interested in his possibilities in this draft. But I want to get a little into your piece at 973ESPN.com on Jason Peters. And you write about foreshadowing his future and what could be happening with him. You know, he's an interesting guy. He did not play in the Super Bowl. He did not play for the second half of the season. He is 36 years old. He makes a little bit of money. What do you see could potentially be happening with Jason Peters' future? Now, keep in mind, everybody, Doug Peterson kind of came out and gave him a pretty, big vote of confidence.
Yeah, and so did Howie Roseman, really. About the only thing he didn't do, stopped a little short of saying 100% he will be back. And he's got a big guarantee coming up on March 16th, the third day of the new league year. So that's probably the drop-dead date where the Eagles, you'll know if they're moving forward with Jason Peters or not. From every indication from both Howie and Doug, it's been they want him to be the left tackle. I still think there's a chance you see another rework deal to lower the cap number a little bit. But every indication the Eagles have given is that Jason Peters will be back again next season.
Realistically, he had an ACL and another one of the other ligament damages. I mean, for a 36-year-old guy, that's a pretty tough injury to have at this stage of his career, right? I mean, and plus he had an Achilles injury recently.
Yeah, in fact, he had two Achilles, and it seems like forever ago where he came back from the second Achilles, and we were talking about that same thing back then. Is how do you come back from that injury at his age with carrying that kind of weight? And he not only did it, he did it and played at a really high level. And it's always a concern. I mean, at some point it has to break in a negative direction as far as age taking a toll on the body. And that's really the biggest issue here, the fact that there aren't many 36-year-old men who can play left tackle at a high level in the NFL, and that's in a best-case scenario when everything's in tip-top condition. And you're talking about a guy who's had a lot of injuries over the years and significant leg injuries. And obviously, as I said, he carries a lot of weight. So you have to be concerned, and I think that is the biggest concern. But the Eagles have pointed out consistently before he got hurt last season, he continued to play at an extremely high level, a Pro Bowl level. Howie's called him a future Hall of Famer. And when you talk about leadership and you talk about some of the intangibles, he's at the top of that list as far as being leaders in that locker room. So things can change. They always do in the NFL, and there's no real use of sort of down-talking players other than if you're preparing to release them and preparing your fan base. And there's been no indication the Eagles feel that way. Everybody, from Doug on down, seems to want him back.
Now, John, if they did move on from Jason Peters, do they like Big V? Or do you think they would look elsewhere? And do you think regardless, they look to add a left tackle in the draft?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the logical positions no matter what. Even if they bring Jason back, they will look at because I do think there's still some concerns. I think Vaitai got progressively better as the season wore on, and he was a solid, certainly not spectacular. But he didn't embarrass himself in the playoffs. I'm not sure. You don't get that feeling, however, that the Eagles are all in in Big V as far as being the ultimate replacement, the heir apparent long-term to Jason Peters. There's still talk of Lane Johnson flipping sides when that ultimately happens, although I think that sort of decreased a little bit because he's so good on the right side, and the league has changed, and, you know, it's not the same as it once was where right tackles aren't as important as left tackles. So a future sort of, at the worst case scenario, you want to throw a number of bodies at the position because the likelihood of replacing Jason Peters at the level he's played at is not great.
Hey, John, Pete talks about left tackle in the draft. When you look at the draft, I know they're at 32, so it's kind of hard to kind of pin down a guy that they might be interested in or whatever, but would the offensive line be at the top of that list at 30? Because when you're drafting deeper in the draft sometimes, you know, I guess sometimes you tend to say, you know what, we can grab our lineman, we're at 32. I know a lot of people think trading 32 and getting out of there is probably the best decision for them because they don't have a 2 and they don't have a 3. But what kind of areas of need do you think they would target at 32? Where are some of the spots they need to kind of look at?
Yeah, I think offensive line would be one of them. I think tight end, because I think this team is sort of getting itself ready to lose Trey Burton in free agency and the possibility of Brent Selleck to retirement. So they need help there behind Zach Ertz. And I think linebacker. The fact that Nigel Bradham is a free agent, you probably can't pay both Nigel and Michael Kendricks, and you have the concerns with the injuries in Jordan Hicks. So I think those are the 3 positions you say those might be the most likely to come off the board first for the Eagles. But you have the luxury at 32, and Howie explained it. It's pretty simple to how the Eagles do their business. They never have 32 first-round grades. So of the people they do, if they have a first-round grade, whatever that number is, probably be about 20 or so. If one of those happens to fall to 32, they'll swipe them up, no matter the position. If not, they probably will trade out and try to accrue some draft capital that they've lost, because they do need to get back in business before the 4th round.
Yeah, that's a big gap there. 1, and then no 2, no 3. You're in the 4th there. So you either have to really get something of need in that 32 spot.
Well, and then there's that thing too, John, right, about like 32 versus the high pick in the 2nd round. Haven't you written before about the money that's guaranteed if you're a first-round pick? I mean, how much different is 32 versus like 38?
Yeah, it's significant, not only the money, but because also first-round picks get that 5th-year option, and the second-round pick only gets the 4 years. So it's very valuable. It's kind of the opposite of the NBA, where everybody tries to trade out. A lot of teams try to trade in at 32 in the NFL because they want that extra year a player under their control if they hit, especially at the quarterback position. And that's why you see so many times people trade up at the bottom of the 1st round to go get quarterbacks, because they have them for an extra year if they happen to hit. And that's obviously big when we talk about roster building, and we constantly talk about you have that window sort of when you hit on the quarterback in the draft, before he gets that second contract where you know he's going to get that 25, 26, 27 million it's up to now as a top-tier quarterback. You have that open window to build the back end of your roster. So it's very important to have that extra year of control at any position, but certainly even more so at quarterback.
Yeah, and, you know, this is a team that through the draft, there's not a whole – I mean, depending on what happens with Bradham, I guess – there's not a whole heck of a lot of holes in the starting 22 that you had last year. A lot of the draft – this is probably going to be a pretty uneventful draft class, you would think.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very deep team. They obviously won the Super Bowl, and they do have, as you mentioned, the majority of their starters under contract as we stand right now. I think the bigger issues with someone we just talked about, Jason Peters – Jordan Hicks as well, coming back from injuries, and obviously Carson Wentz tops that list of the guys coming back from injuries. But as far as starters and talented players, I mean, the Eagles are set as good as anybody in the NFL. So, yeah, this is not a year where you say, man, you got to hit on a first-round pick because we need somebody to contribute. The Eagles have kind of already proven they have a team that can go not only deep in the playoffs but win the whole thing, and the majority of that team is going to be back.
Yeah, and, one area we talk about tight end Burton, that would be an interesting spot. The
Still
kid
have to figure out what they're going to do with Selleck.
Yeah, that's right. And the kid Gesicki from Penn State, he'd be an interesting guy at around 32. He'd be falling in that spot. Defensive tackle, we know that's an area where they might lose a guy. If Bradham ends up walking, that would be another spot. So those three areas there, the backup tight end spot, the defensive tackle rotation, that potential linebacker spot, I'd be pretty surprised if they went out and got a corner in one of those early picks. Well, they don't have a lot of early picks, but one or the fourth round, because corner they seem to be pretty stocked up there. Safety might be a spot where they could use a little depth as well.
Yeah, it can. And Malcolm Jenkins and Rodney McLeod, I think everyone was very, very happy with the way they played. But Malcolm specifically, obviously, he's got a lot of mileage on him. Certainly not an old player at this point, but you want to start thinking about the future. And especially, he's going to be a difficult player to replace because of what he was able to do in his versatility and where he lined up last season. It was almost amazing. In fact, if you break down his snaps, and I think this surprises a lot of people, he lined up as a linebacker, essentially, in their dime package more than anywhere else. It was about 44%, whereas normal strong safety position, he played nickel back. He even played outside cornerback at times. And, the one guy I've talked about before on this show that nobody talks about but gave Jim Schwartz the confidence to do that with Malcolm Jenkins was Corey Graham. And Corey's a 33-year-old guy, and he's a free agent. And it remains to be seen if the Eagles bring him back, if he even wants to play. He might be another one of those guys that says, I want another Super Bowl. Let's go out on top. But he was really, really important to this defense simply because he gave Jim Schwartz the comfort to move Malcolm Jenkins all over the field.
Hey, John, Brandon Graham is going to ring the bell tonight at the Sixers game. Sixers are home, but Brandon Graham is one of those decisions that Howie is trying to deal with, and because he's come out and made it clear that he wants a new contract. How do you see that situation playing itself out?
Yeah, it was a little weird because Howie basically admitted that Brandon deserved more money. Yeah, that's kind of a rare technique for a general manager in this league to take, to actually admit, you know what? Yeah, he's probably underpaid the way he's played over really the past 3 seasons, and he's been so important to that defense. He probably does deserve more money. I was a little surprised by that. Not that we all knew it, but it's just something generally you don't want to say before negotiations start. But you remember last year Brandon left for a little bit in voluntary work, and he claimed there was nothing to it. But I mentioned on the show, wait and see. You'll see something in the summer that comes out. Sure enough, the Eagles tweaked his deal, gave him more incentives. So he's been underpaid for a while. He's probably the number one guy as far as when you look at extensions, as a guy who's probably going to get an extension because the Eagles got to take care of him. He's still playing at a high level, and he's very important in that defense, and I think ultimately they will take care of him.
So Howie had positive things to say about Brandon Graham, but he might have been a little less positive or optimistic about Vinny Curry, right?
Yeah, I mean, Vinny's difficult because of his contract. It's not that he's not an effective player. He's very important to this team, but the reality is he's the top paid defensive end on this team as we speak today, and he's the third best defensive end, essentially. He's way behind Brandon and even Derek Barnett. Everyone kind of realizes he's going to be the starter next year. So Vinny, the Eagles would love to have him back. He's a big part of what Jim Schwartz wants to do, and that's depth on the defensive line and constantly rotating guys. But he can't come back at that number as the highest paid defensive end on this team. He just can't. So something's got to give, whether it's a restructured deal where he takes less money, whether it's a trade. But it can't stay at the status quo because Graham's better and Derek's going to start over Vinny next season.
Walk me through that restructured deal scenario, because when I see a sentence like that, or they could trade him, they could release him and save $5 million, or they could paint a scenario in which he agrees to a pay cut. What player would agree to a pay cut? How does the math work on that they get a guy to agree to a restructured deal? They give more money?
Well, because from their standpoint, if you extend the years on the contract and they're actually making more real dollars, they could look at it in that direction and say that's a better deal for me and my family, ultimately, than releasing the player, especially if you think you're out there and you're not going to get a similar contract. Now, I think Vinny has more value than people probably think, because there's a lot of teams in this league looking for pass rushers, and he's a pretty good pass rusher. So I think in another situation, that contract might not look as bad as it does in Philadelphia. But unfortunately here, it just looks bad. It can't go forward the way it is. And he might be another guy like Trey Burton, like Bo Allen, where ultimately the Eagles will say it's the cost of winning the Super Bowl at some point. And somebody else is going to pay him or can pay him more than we can. It's going to be a very difficult one to figure out for Howie.
I guess the coaches came out. Andy Reid and Chip Kelly both said they enjoyed, or it was fun watching the Eagles win the Super Bowl. Andy Reid, you might believe. Do you really believe Chip Kelly?
I don't believe either of them, to tell you the truth. But, yeah, I mean, more so Andy. I mean, certainly there's got to be a little bit of jealousy. I think that's human nature from any coach. And you wish it was you. But it wasn't for either of those guys. And I'm sure they're happy for the fan base and the fans of the team. But as far as, I'm not as sure they're happy for Howie Roseman and Doug Peterson, only because they would have liked to have done it themselves and obviously weren't able to accomplish it. And we always talk about it with Nick Foles as well. I mean, that'll be forever. I mean, Doug will be the guy. And he was the coach to lead this team to its first Super Bowl championship. You can never take that away from him.
Penn State running back Saquon Barkley had a 4.4 40, but on top of that, he had an absurd 29 reps on the bench press while also a 41-inch vertical. Could we see a guy like Barkley be one of the top two picks?
Yeah, you certainly could. I mean, we've talked about this a lot. It comes down to, look, he's probably a better prospect than whoever you want to put up there as far as the quarterbacks. Most people put Sam Darnold and Josh Rosen 1-2. And NFL scouts probably like Josh Allen more than sort of the YouTube scouts, as I like to call them, because of his arm strength. And I think ultimately there'll be certain teams that put him at a really, really high premium. So it comes down to the point that obviously that position is so much more important than any other position, including running back. You have to ask your questions as an organization. I think from Cleveland's standpoint, look, there's no question. It's a new regime again. But we talk about it all the time, passing on Carson Wentz and Deshaun Watson in back-to-back seasons. More quarterbacks than that, but those two specifically, it's going to be really difficult for them to not go quarterback at number one overall unless they go out and sign Kirk Cousins, which I don't think they'll be in that conversation. And then the New York Giants. It's, you and I, Mike, have had this discussion a lot, and there are certainly people who think Eli Manning's got more in the tank than we do. But I always go back to what Howie Roseman said when he went up to go get Carson Wentz. And his mentality was, we don't plan to be here very often at the top of the draft. So we want to go get the quarterback. And ultimately, I think Dave Gettleman's smart enough to realize that as well. So I think they will go quarterback as well. That's not a knock on Saquon Barkley. It's just the realization that the quarterback position is probably the most important in professional sports.
No doubt. And speaking of a quarterback, very intriguing one in the draft is Lamar Jackson. A lot of people wondering, is he a quarterback? Some teams looking at him as a wideout. Where do you see Lamar?
Well, he's a quarterback. I think it's silly for teams asking him to work out as a wide receiver. I think, the question is he a first-round quarterback? Ultimately, I don't think he is, but I think he's a second-round quarterback, and that's pretty good. So, I mean, you don't ask a second-round level quarterback to try out as a wide receiver. So I think some of that is kind of nonsense. But we kind of talked about earlier when Pete mentioned about that 50-year option. That's the kind of thing that can push a kid like Lamar Jackson into the back end of the first round. Because if you do want a quarterback and you do like him, you want that extra year of control, and that could get him in the back end of the first round. But I certainly think he's a quarterback. He's got some accuracy issues. People automatically want to jump on the race card because he's African American. But remember, teams in this league have asked Tim Tebow to work out at different positions, Eric Crouch to work out at different positions, Rich Gannon, even way back in the day. The New England Patriots drafted him to be a wide receiver, and he refused, and they ultimately traded him to Minnesota. So this has been going on for a really long time. The people who think Lamar Jackson aren't a quarterback, it's not necessarily any race-related issue. It's just bad scouting.
Eric,
it comes down to.
Eric Crouch, you throw that in there for me, Johnny Mack? Yeah, if he was okay getting hit over the middle, he might have been okay in Mike Martz's offense way back when. But hey, before we let you go, I gotta ask if you saw what Chris Webber did last night on the TNT broadcast, where he called Ben Simmons amphibious. I know you're a wordsmith.
He's ambidextrous. I don't know if he's amphibious, but I just want Ben Simmons to learn how to shoot a free throw, and if he can do that,
left, right, doesn't matter.
Yeah, if he can figure out how to do that, I think he's a top 5 player in the NBA tomorrow. If he can figure out how to make a free throw.
It literally came out like this. He said, "I don't know. Is this guy left-handed, right-handed? Is he amphibious?" And then Marv Albert replied, "I think he is amphibious."
Well, he's got a lot of talent, so maybe he can add that. Maybe he can put that in the check column as well.
You think they learned when that Pat Venditti kid came pitching for the Oakland A's and he was left and right? I think it was the Boston Globe or Associated Press put out a story with the headline, "Amphibious pitcher makes debut." I mean, these people have made this mistake before.
Yeah, well, once you make the mistake once, people kind of latch on and they continue to make it. But ambidextrous.
That's the
word. The proper term.
Apparently, Charles Shackelford once said, "Left hand, right hand, it doesn't matter. I'm amphibious." And Yogi Berra said of a teammate once.
Well, Yogi, obviously, Yogi. That was the brilliance of Yogi. And my favorite would be what is it? What percentage of baseball is mental, and the other is so Yogi. The Yogi-isms are legendary.
John McMullen is legendary.
As are you, yes.
So is his coverage at 97.3ESPN.com, at JF McMullen on Twitter. Give him a follow there. This weekend, plenty of NFL news and notes at 97.3ESPN.com. Thanks, pal.
Hey, thank you, guys.